Hey everybody, welcome back to the JPM Caller in Focus. This is going to be part two. We're going to have a little bit of fun today, a little bit of review. We're going to talk about building a new one and then get a little bit closer to where we really want to be, which is understanding how the Greeks affect positions and how that influences stock markets. So again, my options cash flow blueprint, check it out in the description and in the comments below. I think it's about 120 pages, 125 pages, literally from the very, very beginning of your journey as an options trader, options seller for cash flow, all the way to what is going to get you very close to being a volatility ninja like me. So check it out, download it. There's actually another book there, Crush the Premium, the two together. Very, very good companion books to check out and absolutely free. So let's take a look at the caller again. Remember, this fund is going to buy a put spread. So it's called a put spread caller. It's going to buy a put spread, which is buying a 5% roughly out of the money put. It's going to sell a 20% out of the money put as well. So these are both puts for the put protection, right? Some people just go ahead and buy put protection for their portfolios. That costs them a little bit of money. Think of that as an insurance policy that can protect you to a certain extent to the downside if the market falls out of bed. But what the put spread caller does, and the reason it's kind of like a collar, you can kind of think of it as being surrounded. The market is being surrounded by these two pieces, which is the put spread. What they do is they try to finance this put spread, whatever they've paid for this, they look for a call that is going to pay for that spread. So you're paying for the put spread. That's an outlay of money. You're paying for your insurance. That comes out of pocket. And then you're going to sell a call, much like you would with a cover call, which is essentially what you're doing. And you're going to look for the one that pays for the full cost of this. So they want this to be a costless protective structure on their underlying market holding, right? So this goes on top of holding the market. In this case, it's going to be the market in general. They own a whole bunch of stocks, not exactly the S&P 500, but they're sort of targeting something that looks very much like that. Slightly different, as we talked about in video number one, but effectively quite different. These are cash settle, right? So there's no, if this thing goes through the call, we know that we're going to be obligated to sell. If this were an American option, we'd have to sell the stock if it closed above that strike price on expiry. But with cash settled options, there's just cash that's exchanged, right? So if you lose money on that call, you just have to pay the other side. If you make money on this put spread, you get paid for whatever you're up money on. So this is a little bit different with European options. And it's important, especially if you have a fund that is not in 100% fungible, right? What they own is not the S&P 500. It's about 160 names instead of 500 names. So it's kind of trying to benchmark against the S&P 500, but it isn't exactly. And this is kind of a nice way, very liquid options markets in index. And it works well because there's just either you give up cash, you get cash. In the end, it all comes out in the wash. So let's take a look. So an example of this, if we were to do this on the SPY, is we would buy 100 puts here at about a 5% out of the money. We would sell 100 puts, 20% out of the money, meaning 20% below where the market's trading. And then we would look for that call that pays for that put spread, and we would sell the 100 calls up there. And this would be against 10,000 shares of SPY. So all one for one, right? You're fully protected, or pretty darn close. You're not always going to get absolutely perfect on it, but you can get pretty darn close in this particular case, especially because we're just talking about 10,000 shares. So let's have a little bit of fun and assume that we're running this fund and it's come to the end of the quarter and we're letting the other structure expire, and we're going to open a new structure and overlay it on top of the holdings that we have. So we're going to look, remember, we're going to look for that 5% out of the money put. So the S&P is right now trading at 55.80. And we're going to go in there and we're going to look for that 5% out of the money put. So here we are on the options chain for the SPX. And we're going to go out right now. It's the end of March. So what we're going to be doing, this is going to work out almost perfectly. We're going to go right out to the June expiry, right? That's going to be our next expiry for this put spread caller. So right now, The market is at 55.80. So let's look up 55.80. We can see where the color, the shading changes here is the at the money. So 55.80, and we're going to look for that 5% out of the money put, which is going to get us down. I'm not going to do the math for you, but 5% of 55.80, we would call that the 95 put in option speak. So the 95 put is the 5% out of the money put. And we're going to go down to 5,300. So we're going to buy that 5,300, which we've done down here, for $109.70. Now, what's our next step? Well, we're going to complete the put spread part of the strategy, which is to look for a 20% out of the money put to sell. So the 20% out of the money put, I'll just tell you, is about the 44.60. So we're going to go all the way down to the 44.60 in the same month. Remember, this is all in the same expiry. 44.60, we're going to sell those at 20.80. So look at the top two lines here. We've got the long put, which gives us the protection. We've got the short put at the 44.60 that reduces the cost of the protection, right? Why would we do this? Why would we sell that put? Well, it gets us back about $21 of the 110 that we're spending on the put. Now, it's also curtailing the protective value in this put spread, right? If we were to just buy the put, we would be protected all the way to S&P 0. Now, the assumption is that S&P is probably not going to go to 0, and if it does, we've got bigger problems in the world than our money. So we're going to, in a lot of cases, many managers will do this. They will put spread because of another thing that we're going to talk about in a moment, which is the skew. But before we get to that, basically, this is going to cut down on the cost of the put protection to the tune of $20.80. So it's not a massive amount, but I'm going to show you how put plays into that in a moment. So what have we spent here? Well, we've spent about, what is that, 88.90 on the put spread. So what do we have to do? Well, we've got to go and look for the call that covers that cost, because when we sell a call, we are receiving the premium. When we buy a put, or buy a call for that matter, we are spending money. That's an outlay of cash, a debit. So far, we have spent $88.90 on the put spread, so we're going to go up and look for a call. It's rather easy to do. You just keep scanning for the call that's going to pay you roughly that price. And we have that right here. And I figured this out. It's the 58.30. And I'm assuming maybe we get filled mid-market, right? Just to make this nice and clean. It's not always going to be perfectly clean. And we're getting 88.90 for that. So we've spent 88.90. We're getting 88.90 from the sale of the call, which is effectively a cover call in a sense. And that's offsetting the cost of the put. Here you go. Boom, you've got your costless caller for your S&P 500 holdings, whatever that may be. In the case of the JPM caller, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. All the familiar names, it's going to look quite similar to the S&P 500, but a little bit different, not 100% fungible. So there's our costless caller. Okay, so now we're going to have a little bit of fun with Greeks, right? We're going to get a little deeper into where the volatility dynamics kind of matter with the put spread caller. So here's your market. You've got it trading at 55.80. We can see the strikes down here at the bottom. You've got your long put here at 5,300. You've got your short put at 44.60, and you've got your short call that finances the put spread. So here's your caller. You basically have the put spread on the downside. You've got the caller finance you've got the call finance portion above you. You're kind of surrounded by this caller. So notice another thing on this chart here, which is this line that slopes from the upper left down towards the bottom. And that's the skew in this particular expiry, which is the end of June expiry that we're creating the structure on. And so skew basically describes something a little deeper from an implied vol standpoint that you would normally get. If you look at a chart of implied volatility, it tends to just kind of give you the at the money implied volatility, which would be the implied volatility right here at this point on the line. And for many kinds of measurements and sort of just as a general idea of where option pricing is trading, a lot of the time that's just fine. But if you want to get a little deeper, you can look at where the out of the money puts are trading and where the out of the money calls are trading. That's going to give you a slightly different picture. So that's called skew. The skew is kind of the where the puts are trading relative to the calls. So skew can go up because puts are going up, but it can also go up because call skew is going down. I know that's a little tricky to get right off at the outset here, but this is sort of a very moving, it's kind of almost like two tails, this tail here and this tail here. Both those tails are kind of wagging to give us a skew number. What you can do is you can separate them out. You can say, okay, well, what's the put skew? So that's going to give you put skew at a given, maybe a collectively a put skew, or it can give you put skew at a particular strike, which is going to be interesting, or it can do the same for calls. And so you'll notice the shape of this is kind of interesting. We call this a smirk. Sometimes the skew is a smile, which is more high up here, down towards the at the money implied volatility, and then up again. So that would be called a smile. This is more of a smirk, where the downside tends to be a little bit higher. This is very, very common in the S&P index. It virtually never changes this kind of shape. It will vary. This will get more or less steep, as will the calls, but you'll rarely ever see calls trading at a higher implied volatility than the puts. You might see that in the Russell 2000 sometimes. It can happen in some, and certainly can happen in single name. But in the S&P, extremely rare. You have one of the most pronounced smirks out there. Why does this exist? Well, under normal circumstances, we would almost assume that this would just be a flat line, right? But the word is, in 1987, when there was that massive crash, which was truly epic, 20% plus in one day, which was epic. The VIX didn't exist back then, but it hit a level of something like 170 or 180. If you were sort of to extrapolate the VIX value. So it was an extremely, extremely tumultuous period for the stock market. And the word is that market makers kind of went, uh-oh, stocks can crash down. And that before that, it was a bit more of a flat skew. There was no skew, in a sense. They would charge people a 22 implied volatility at the money, and they would charge people a 22 implied volatility way out of the money on the puts. Now, there's some debate as to whether this story is true or not, but I think effectively you can kind of make the assumption that, well, markets tend to crash to the downside. They don't crash to the upside. So stands to reason that people are going to be demanding more for those downside puts. So sellers of this insurance are not going to be as excited to sell this implied vol at a very low level. So they're demanding, the market is demanding. It's not market makers. Market makers aren't doing anything necessarily. People tend to think that. The market is setting the prices here. Supply and demand, good old supply and demand, is saying that, look, this is what you're going to have to pay if you want downside protection. Part of the reason this exists is that there is really kind of a supply and demand driven dynamic going on here. To the downside, people are buying puts, right? They own stocks, they buy downside puts, just like they own their homes and they buy insurance for their homes. To the upside, and that's more demand driven. To the upside, and in fact, I will say that many funds actually have, pensions and things like that are going to have a mandate to own downside insurance. So there's a structural demand for insurance, which tends to kind of push up that skew. To the upside, this is much more supply driven. People are selling calls. Covered call funds are 20 times bigger than they were even just 5 or 6 years ago. So there's a lot of funds out there that are just constantly hammering down this volatility risk premium. Hopefully you guys saw my video on that. Hammering this volatility risk premium, which quite frankly ends up being extremely thin or non-existent on the call side, but they do it anyway. I did that for many years, running a whole bunch of funds, and I wasn't thrilled to sell some of those really, really cheap calls, I'll tell you. And I tried to avoid doing it as much as I could. But the upside tends to be supply driven. Lots of sellers trying to monetize volatility. You'll see that in market rallies. People are hammering out calls, trying to kind of set levels where they think the market perhaps can't get past, and they figure, well, I might as well get paid right now if it's not going to go past there. It tends to go past, and we're going to finish off today talking about that very concept. Does it go past that level or not? We'll see. So here's your skew. The interesting thing about the put caller is that it takes advantage of the skew a little bit, right? So it's buying this more expensive skew relative to the at the money, but it's also selling this way out of the money skew. And that's a really, really interesting thing to look at. And so basically this is kind of a 20-ish vol, 20 implied volatility. And this is more like a 30, 31 implied volatility. It's a big difference, a very big difference. Now this is a $20 put we're selling. If it was the SPY, it would be a $2 put. Doesn't sound like much, does it? But let's do a little fun exercise to notice how much skew makes a difference in terms of option pricing. Okay, so let's look at how volatility can really affect the pricing of an option. It can be quite drastic. So here's your index at 55.80, and here's the strike price of the put that we're short, right? We're long one put, and we're short the way further out of the money put, which is like a 2 or 3 delta, which is very distant from where the market is trading. So it's trading about a 30 volatility, right? So if we look back at the options that we've traded, we can see here we've got our long put is trading at about a 22.75 implied volatility. Remember, implied volatility is just kind of a relative measurement of option pricing. If it's very high, as it would be like on a Tesla that's moving around a lot, or if it's very low, which could be like on a Ford or J&J or something that isn't very volatile, you're going to have that different volatility, right? Think of it as life insurance on an 88-year-old versus life insurance on a 30-year-old. One's going to imply a lot more movement, a lot higher risk of movement, as in the case of the stock market, higher risk of other things with the life insurance. But so implied volatility can really matter. That can really affect the price that we're paying for insurance. If it's something very volatile, then we're going to have to pay a lot higher implied volatility. And the skew that we talked about is really modeling higher volatility to the downside, right? So if you look at the vol we've paid, 22.75, and the one that we've sold, which is about 31, that lower short put is $20.80. Well, let's take a look. Here's your 30 vol. Let's just make it a 30 vol. Here's your $20.11, theoretical price of that. Let's change that to, let's assume flat skew, right? Flat skew would mean all of these are kind of trading at the same implied volatility instead of skew, which is really kind of showing up in the put side, which are much more expensive. So let's lower this one, this 31 vol, this 30 vol basically, down to a 22.75 vol. Let's lower it to the price of the put that we've purchased. So we're going to go 22, let's just say 22. Look at the theoretical price, $3.57. I'm going to go back there again. Let's go 31, $23, 30, $20. If I lower the implied volatility of the put to of the short put to the implied volatility of the one that I'm long, it's only worth $2.57. That's 1/10. It goes from over $20 to $2.57. That is skew. That is the skew that you're really seeing in motion there, right? So as you go down to lower and lower strikes on the S&P 500 or the SPY or really many stocks for that matter, you're going to see implied volatility rise. People are paying less, right? Somebody who's paying $2.35, that's all they care about is $2.35. They don't care that that's a really high implied volatility. So when people go out in black swan funds, which I used to run a couple of them for years, I would just go out and buy a bunch of teenies. I mean, sometimes I do VIX, sometimes I do other kinds of interesting butterflies and things like that if I saw Edge in other places. But some of the time I would just buy a whole bunch of these teeny puts, and I knew I was paying a crazy high implied volatility, but that's the way it is, right? These are the things that are going to explode in value. You get a huge crash, and a 4150 is going to go from $13 to $150. I mean, you are going to make some serious money on something like that. So people don't mind paying a little extra for that. So that's basically, you can really see skew play out there in the way that this pricing goes from $257 to basically $21. I mean, almost 10 times the value. So that's it for today. Next time we're going to start with, I know in the first video we said we're going to do gamma. We're going to do that next lesson. So in lesson number 3, we're going to start off with how has this fund done, and maybe add some insight as to why that may be. And then we're going to get into gamma, which I know a lot of you have been waiting for. I've been people ask me for more videos on gamma all the time because it's such a hot thing. It's such an important thing these days, pushing stocks around, that we're going to really cover that in depth. And then in either the next video or the one after that, we're going to get into the second order Greeks and talk about VANA and charm and how those things play out. So it's going to be really fun and educational, and we will see you in the next video.